Did men used to live to 900 years old? Many Christians would say yes, and they use Genesis 5, among other passages, as a common proof text for this view. But does Genesis 5 support the idea of men living for several centuries, or are there other more plausible interpretations? Now, on the surface, it would seem that it's a resounding no. But if you've seen the other parts of the series, then you'll be well aware of the fact that just because it may appear obvious on the surface, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is. And another thing you'll be aware of if you've seen the earlier installments of this series is the use of symbolic numbers in Genesis. Now, although every symbolic number is indeed a number, not every number is a symbolic number. So, are there any reasons to read these numbers symbolically? Well, the first thing we need to do is define what a symbolic number is and see if we can find any correlations in the Bible. You may already be familiar with the number 7 and its symbolic significance as a number of completion in ancient Israelite culture. But is it featured heavily in the genealogies? Well, yes, and I'll give a few examples here, while also saving a few others for later, as they'll relate to something else I'm going to present. One individual who has a strong affinity with this symbolic number is Lamech. He is the seventh born from Enosh, which means man, and he lived for 777 years. Another example of the use of 7 in an age that may be symbolic comes later on in the Genesis account, with Sarah, who died at 127. Now, initially this may seem odd, as just having the number 7 in your age isn't necessarily symbolic. If I die at the age of 76, that doesn't mean it's a symbolic age, but instead it probably means I just died at 76. The symbolic nature of the number comes from what 7 is paired with, though, to get 127, which is, of course, 120. You see, 120 was seen as an idealized age in ancient Semitic culture, and therefore, when you combine the idealized age of 120 with the number of completion 7, you get 127. But this isn't the only example of 120 being used for a symbolic age. Moses died at the age of 120. Interestingly, there's another potential indicator of the symbolic nature of Moses' age, but we'll get there soon enough. It should also be noted that 120 isn't the only idealized age used in the biblical text. 110 was an idealized age in ancient Egypt. And what do you know, Joshua and Joseph, two men who lived in Egypt, died at 110. Speaking of Joseph, there are periods of his life that may be symbolically set, as he lived 17 years with his father Jacob in Canaan, and 17 years with his father Jacob in Egypt. Another, even more clear example of ages being separated into sets is Moses. Remember, I said there was another potential indicator for the symbolic nature of Moses' age. Moses lived 40 years in Egypt, 40 years as a shepherd, and 40 years as the leader of Israel. And finally, I wanted to mention on the tail end of things that Enoch was assumed into heaven at the age of 365, the number of days in the solar calendar. But the Israelites weren't the only ones to follow such a pattern of symbolic numerology. I've already mentioned the Egyptian idealized age, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There is another ancient list full of what are obviously non-literal numbers, especially if you seek to defend young earth creationism, and that is the Sumerian kings list. The kings featured in this list lived for thousands and thousands of years, and when we add up their ages, we get something much greater than how old young earthers believe the earth is. The fact that we can find other examples of ancient writings using obviously non-literal numbers should make it quite clear that it's at least possible for the Bible to do the same, and given the aforementioned evidence, it certainly seems that they probably did. Now, what may be most interesting is the fluidity of genealogies seems to continue even into the New Testament era, as the Gospel of Matthew, when listing the genealogy of Jesus, functions very similarly. Matthew removes Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah, and Jehoiakim when listing the genealogy. But this isn't a mistake on Matthew's part. He makes it clear that he's laying out 3 sets of 14 to get 42. This isn't an error, it's a theological point, and we should acknowledge that. If the New Testament can use non-literal genealogies, then I have very little problem with giving that same courtesy to the Old Testament. Now, that was just the positive case for affirming the non-literalness of the ages in the Old Testament. There are also problems that a literal reading of these ages may produce. The most popular example is Abraham, as he has a few things that relate to him on this issue. One thing that isn't a knockdown argument, but is definitely interesting, is the fact that Abraham is said to be of fullness of age when he died. Yet, if these ages are literal, his great-great-great-great-grandfather Eber outlived him. Speaking of Eber, the Hebrew people got their name from him, so it seems odd that a figure as important as him never once appears in the Abrahamic narratives if he was really still kicking at this time. Now, one could respond by saying that this is all a bit speculative and could even be classified as an argument from silence, something I've argued against in the past. But there's one important thing that one needs to take into consideration, and that's how patriarchal cultures function. The point is that the oldest surviving male ancestor should be revered and honored as the chief consultant for the family. That's why figures such as Eber, or really any of the other patriarchs' absence, is so difficult to grapple with when applying strict literalism to these ages. It's hard to understand why Abraham never consulted these figures, or why, possibly even more puzzling, Abraham himself was never consulted by Jacob or Esau. If the ages line up, he should have still been alive when they were born, and Jacob would have had good reason to consult him. You see, God made Jacob the founder of Israel, and this promise was originally given to Abraham about his descendants. The most logical reason they never talk is because Abraham was already dead, and the text itself seems to indicate that, as Abraham's death comes first in the narrative before the birth of Jacob and Esau. But we aren't done with Abraham quite yet. Like I said, he is a common figure of interest in this debate. Now, we all know the story of Isaac's miraculous birth. Sarah had been barren for years, and by this point Abraham and Sarah were far too old to have any children. So when Abraham is told the news that he'll have a son, he initially doesn't believe it, and even laughs at the prospect. This is demonstrated perfectly in Genesis chapter 17, verse 17, where the text records, "Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, 'Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?'" But the confusing thing is that if the ages are literal, Abraham's own father Terah would have been fathering children at 130, and his grandson Jacob does the same at 105. Yet neither of these events are seen as a miracle or even out of the ordinary. Now, that's all there is to say on Abraham, but there's something to note about his son Isaac. Isaac's motives for blessing Esau was because he was near death, and was at the point where he was pretty much blind. So, what's the problem? Well, if this is literal, then Isaac was 137 at this time, but he wouldn't die until he was 180, meaning he would have been on his deathbed for about 43 years, a quarter of his full life. Now, we've talked a lot about the ages of various figures within the Old Testament, but now I want to get back to Genesis 5 in particular. When we look at the 10 men in the genealogies, we can see 3 separate specific ages for each man: the age when they became a father, the remaining years they lived after that, and their complete lifespan. This gives us in total 30 different numbers found in the genealogical list. Now, this alone isn't something that I see any symbolic meaning in, but the numbers themselves definitely tend to appear non-literal. Now, if we lay out all 30 numbers next to each other, there is something very odd that you may notice. All these numbers, with one exception, are divisible by 5 or end in a 2 or a 7. Now, maybe that doesn't sound all that weird. It definitely didn't sound too odd to me at first either. But the likelihood that these numbers would naturally occur this way was calculated at about 0.0000006%. The numbers that are divisible by 5 make up about 2/3 of the list, and the remaining numbers that end in a 7 or a 2 can be made divisible by 5 by just subtracting that symbolic number 7. It seems that these numbers have all been divisible by 5 in the original source, but the number 7 was added on in later times by other scribes for whatever reason. But what about that one exception that I mentioned earlier? Well, that exception is Methuselah, and he really isn't that different, because all we have to do here is subtract 7 twice to get a number divisible by 5. While some figures had 7 added to their age, it seems that Methuselah was given the gold treatment, as 7 was added to his age twice. This could have been by mere coincidence, as 2 separate scribes may have added 7 to his age, or it could have been intentional, as an attempt to sort of venerate Methuselah by giving him the number 7 twice. Whatever the reason may be, it seems abundantly clear that the number 7 was added to his age twice to get the number that we would have now in the modern Genesis text. But perhaps, for one reason or another, you're still not convinced that these ages are stylized in any particular way. And at this point, I would simply suggest comparing the Genesis 5 ages to the extremely random and natural years found for the Israelite and Judahite kings. Starting with Rehoboam, we see reigns that last for 17 years, 3 years, 41 years, 2 years, 24 years, 7 days, 12 years, 22 years, 25 years, 2 years, 8 years, 1 year, 28 years, 40 years, 17 years, 16 years, 29 years, 52 years, 41 years, 6 months, 1 month, 10 years, 2 years, 20 years, 16 years, 16 years, 9 years, 29 years, 55 years, 2 years, 21 years, 3 months, 11 years, 3 months, and 11 years. These numbers clearly aren't stylized in any certain way, and when you compare them to the Genesis 5 ages, even without my aforementioned comments and arguments, you can see a clear difference between how the numbers function. Now, one thing I mentioned without stopping to really explain is the idea that there not only could have been earlier sources that the biblical text may have used, but also that they may have told things slightly differently than the Bible does. This is something that many Christians find appalling and think compromises the inspiration and/or infallibility of the Bible. But I don't think it does. One thing that is certain in regards to the New Testament is that at least parts of it used pre-existing traditions. I've spoken on this since my first video, where I talked about how Paul passes on an earlier tradition about the resurrection of Jesus to the Corinthian church. If the New Testament can use pre-existing traditions, I don't really see why the Old Testament can't. But some people still find this problematic, because I acknowledge that the original sources could have had differences to the final product, which certainly isn't the case with 1 Corinthians 15:3-5, which contains the tradition that I mentioned just a second ago. But I still don't see this as a problem, and that's simply because God inspires the Bible, but not necessarily the original sources and traditions, and I can provide what I think to be a useful analogy or example of this. In Galatians chapter 1, Paul warns the churches of Galatia not to follow another false gospel. If the heretics spreading this false gospel are anything like later heretics, then they probably tried to base their beliefs in the teaching of Christ. The Gnostics did this all the time, and they most likely would have had their own Jesus stories where he taught their beliefs instead of orthodoxy. Keep in mind, Galatians was written prior to any of the 4 Gospels, so while there could be earlier traditions about Jesus spread by heretics, this doesn't mean God inspired these. Likewise, God only inspires the final text, so the content of earlier sources, whether they be written or oral, isn't relevant to the final product. Now, I realize this last bit was fairly irrelevant to the rest of the video, but because I know it's something that people will be concerned about, I decided to address it here and get it out of the way sooner rather than later. But with that being said, thank you for watching this video.